Hey everybody, thanks for joining me. My name is Nate Gustafson. I serve as the volunteer coordinator with Brookdale Hospice in the Denver area, and I'm so thankful that you are joining me for this training presentation on understanding grief and loss, healing towards wholeness. Whoever you might be and wherever you might be serving, I know that you are advancing hope. I know that you are making tomorrow a better day for folks who are in need, whether that's the children in your first grade classroom, whether that's the seniors at the senior center that you work at, whether that's the folks on your bus as you travel around the city, or if you're like the folks I work with on a daily basis, you might be in the hospice world and you might be helping people on their end-of-life journey as either as a volunteer or a professional caregiver. No matter what you do and how you do it, you encounter folks who are going through loss, who are literally being torn apart in their grief. And so this presentation will help us today to understand the grief process and pursue healing and wholeness. And it'll even help us as we do this important work and help us remember that we need to take care of ourselves and we need to spend time focusing on our own grief. This is a great quote from the great Carl Jung. Learn your theories as well as you can, but put them aside when you touch the miracle of a living soul. All these theoretical approaches, all these strategies are nothing in comparison to just showing up, tuning in to the person in need, listening with your whole heart, soul, mind, strength, your hands, your head, your heart, and then being able to walk with them through their grief journey. Grief and bereavement, literally, the word bereavement comes from the word being torn apart. So if you could imagine ripping a piece of paper in two, that's what going through a significant loss can do to you. And it's really based upon the theory that we all maintain close proximity to, we get invested in them, and we get interested in their lives, and we bond, we connect. So as you start at the top of the circle with attachment, you develop a relationship with someone, you get to know them. Either you're working together, you're riding the bus together, you see them at Starbucks every morning, and you exchange emotional energy. So you bond, you connect. And as you get closer and closer to each other, you start to have more and more affinity, more and more positive feelings and positive regard for that person. However, we know that all attachments eventually end. No one lives forever. No relationship stands the absolute test of time. And so eventually there will become a separation or a loss due to health or environment or death or moving a far distance away. And that separation triggers the natural and normal grieving process, that feeling of being torn apart. And so as we process through grief, we need to remember that there is no right or wrong way to grieve. Thinking that there is a right way to grieve, that's a myth. Thinking that grief is only a one-year process, that's a myth. Thinking that we can predict grief, that's certainly a myth. And the cultural feelings in the Western world that tears are a sign of weakness, that also is a myth. Grief is more than just emotion. It's a physical response. It's a mental response. When you're feeling torn apart, your brain does not click. Things do not make sense in your mental cognitive space. It affects our social, our interpersonal world. It affects the way we behave. It affects us spiritually, existentially. We ask a lot of big, tough questions when we're being honest about the difficulties of going through grief. Now, we're going to take a look here at a number of different stages and theories of grief, and there's many out there. And there isn't necessarily, again, a right or a wrong way to view grief. We just need to realize that all of these stages, all of these theories, all of these ways of talking about grief are meant to help us understand really what's at the heart of this feeling torn apart. So it's typical to think about the stages of grief, and we'll talk about the most famous stage theory of grief, but here's a theory that just basically puts grief into three phases: the shock phase, the suffering phase, and then the healing phase. Other stage theories of grief might be shock and numbness, a searching, a yearning to be put back together, feeling completely disoriented, and then eventually coming to a time and a space where we are reorganized and feel resolved. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross studied in the 60s what the normal and natural responses were for a person who is going through a terminal illness. And then that applied also to folks who are going through grief. So you could say that grief is a form of terminal illness, so to speak, in the Kubler-Ross world. Her stages, what we've heard many, many times, are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and then acceptance. I don't have time right now to point it out to you, but I'd highly recommend you going onto YouTube and searching for the grief giraffe video. You heard it right. Giraffe, like the animal. The grief giraffe video on YouTube is absolutely hysterical and takes a funny look at the Kubler-Ross stages of grief. I would also highly encourage you, if you have not yet or do not know of the gentleman named Dr. Alan Wolfelt. I have a personal affinity for his work, not only because it's excellent work, but he's also a Colorado guy. So he's in Fort Collins with the Center for Transition and Loss. And he talks about the tasks of grief, or the tasks of the mourner. And one of the very first ones is to accept the reality of the loss. As we walk through our denial, as we walk through the cloud and the fog, it's so important that we get to the point where we accept that the loss is real. That person that we lost in our life, or our puppy dog, or our goldfish that died, they are not going to walk back through that door. That beautiful, beloved golden retriever is not going to come wagging its tail back at us. We have to accept the reality of the loss. We have to feel the pain. We cannot go through grief in a healthy manner without feeling the pain. And we also need to continue to build our nurturing system. We need to build and support a nurturing self-support system, as well as a community of support. It's so important. You may have heard of the term complicated grief. Well, complicated grief is just another way of talking about the extra hardness of grief. All grief is complicated at one sense or another. If you feel like your heart and your soul is being torn apart, it's going to be complicated to get over that. But complicated grief specifically talks about what might be delayed grief, a person that doesn't really experience the grief at all the different levels until way further down the road. Exaggerated grief, this may be a very simple loss, like lost your keys, lost your wallet someday, and you just had to go through the process of canceling all your credit cards. Maybe that grief takes on a whole nother life and completely takes over a person's life. That could be exaggerated grief. Chronic grief, just an ongoing inability to just walk through life, could be also very complicated grief. And masked grief, that a person just puts a mask over their emotions, over their true feelings, and refuses to deal with the reality of what's going on. Kenneth Doga is an expert in the grief field, and he talks about disenfranchised grief, which I think is such a key part of the grief process. Anytime when a loss is or cannot be openly acknowledged, publicly mourned, or socially supported, that can be disenfranchised grief. A person may not feel like their support system is going to truly understand the depth of their despair over the loss of their goldfish. And yet that goldfish may have been a symbol of something much, much more than just a little fish that swam in a tank. That might have been a symbol of their childhood. That might have been a symbol of a relationship to their loved ones, their family of origin. And going through that loss might be significant for that person. But if you had lost your goldfish and you felt like no one understood that, no one would allow you the grace and the acceptance to publicly mourn little Goldie and that loss, that could be a disenfranchised grief. You may feel completely isolated and alone in your grief because no one feels like that's a socially acceptable level of grief over the loss of a goldfish. Here's a great quote from Thomas Merton. True love and prayer are learned in the hour when prayer has become impossible and your heart has turned to stone. Grief has a way of making even the simplest of activities, whether that be cooking dinner, packing your lunch, going for a walk, getting groceries, cleaning your house. Grief can make all of those seem just impossible, let alone feel like you can have a spiritual life again, feel like God or the divine or the higher power that you believe in is truly accessible in that time. So even prayer can become quite a challenge in grief. Derek Walcott states, break a vase, and the love that resembles the fragments is stronger than the love which took its symmetry for granted when it was whole. So again, Dr. Christina Pachelski says, in the provider of grief support, so as a volunteer, as a teacher, as a lay leader in your congregation, we need to see our role in supporting those going through grief, not as one who sees to fix someone, because if we try to fix someone, we think that they're broken. Just because someone is grieving, they are not broken. When we think that we're there to help someone through their grief, we treat them as if they're weak, as if they're less than strong in their ability. But when we seek to serve, when we see life as whole, and we see someone as a struggler, as a fellow sojourner on the journey, and we're just looking to serve that person along in the journey, then we are a partner with that person in their grief, and that is a much healthier way to see our role. If you are out there caring for someone who is sick, who is ill, who is terminal, who may be dying, it is so critical that we explore what it looks like to take care of ourselves, to grieve our own losses as we lose these relationships. Healthcare especially. I have just seen in the last 13 years I'm working in healthcare a wide road of burnout that is just like the whole size of the continent of North America. And that burnout is due to a number of reasons, but healthcare workers or anyone who is a people helper, we are prone to the potential for burnout. And yet because we don't explore our feelings, we don't recognize the red flags, we're really quick to point life, but we're not quick to see them in our own. And we need to learn to practice boundaries. We need to set limits. We need to cultivate that support system and that community that will help carry us through. So if I could write a prescription for self-care, I often joke I'm going to make up my own doctor's prescription pad and just write out prescriptions for things like rest, for taking a nap, for getting sleep, for going for healthy walks or hikes in nature, taking time to reflect and journal, being okay with time alone. That is so critical, so crucial, just to take the time to be with yourself and to think, to pray, to meditate, to talk with other colleagues about those stresses, about the unique trials and struggles that you're going through. That's why it's so important as hospice volunteers to get together with other volunteers, to take time to connect with your hospice coordinator, to do whatever you can to just go through this process with other people so that you're not alone. Reading, whether it's spiritual readings, whether it's novels, whether it's something that engages you like meditation, prayer, worship, rituals are so important. And again, these rituals could be that you have a certain ritual, a certain meditation, or certain prayer that you say before and after every visit with someone, either in the hospital or through a hospice setting. It could be that you, again, participate in certain retreats. It could be that you have a certain podcast or certain spiritual teacher that you listen to on a regular basis. For me, just about every Tuesday, I have a very specific podcast that I listen to, and every Monday I have a podcast I listen to on the way to work that's a very spiritual, nourishing, and uplifting time for me on Mondays before I make sure I start the week off right. And then Tuesdays I have another one that oftentimes lasts on into Wednesdays. And then throughout my time, I try to make sure I spend a lot of time listening to music, because for me, music really fills my soul. Again, I just want to thank you for going through this journey with other people who are literally feeling torn apart. We need to see ourselves as servants on the journey with another sojourner, with a fellow journeyman, journeywoman going through life's trials, troubles, losses. So please take care of yourself, take care of the ones that you love, and spend time reaching out to those who are in the journey with you to make sure that we can love each other, support each other, as we spend time helping those through service, not through seeing them as weak, but through serving those who are going through a time of grief.